The moment you start proving you're a good person, you've already lost. Lost ground, lost leverage, lost something quieter, but far more important. Because nothing violent happened. No one attacked you, no one shouted, no one pointed a finger and said you're wrong. It was softer than that. I just expected better from you. If you were really kind, you wouldn't have done that. I'm not judging, I'm just disappointed. And right there, right in that pause, you felt it. That tightening in your chest, that urge to explain, to clarify, to tell the full story so they'd finally see your heart. So you spoke. You explained your intention, your context, your exhaustion, your good motives. And without realizing it, you changed roles. You weren't communicating anymore. You were defending. Not your actions, your character. That's the trap no one warns you about, because the moment you start proving you're a good person, the conversation stops being human. It becomes a trial. You don't notice the shift at first. The room looks the same. The faces look familiar. But suddenly, you're seated lower. Your words sound thinner, and everything you say feels like evidence. Evidence of goodness, evidence of intent, evidence that you deserve to be seen as decent. You didn't choose this courtroom. No one dragged you in. You walked in yourself. And here's the uncomfortable part. The more you explain, the more authority you hand over. The more you justify, the more you accept their right to judge. The more you try to look good, the more you silently agree that your worth is up for debate. That's why it feels so exhausting. That's why it never actually ends. Because once you start proving, the bar keeps moving. Today it's your tone, tomorrow it's your priorities, next time it's your values. And you keep talking, keep clarifying, keep polishing yourself into something more acceptable, all while something inside you shrinks. Think about it. Have you ever seen a mountain explain why it deserves to stand? Have you ever watched an oak tree argue for its strength in a storm? Of course not. They don't convince, they remain. But you were taught something different. You were taught that being good means being understood, that silence looks like guilt, that if you don't explain yourself, you must be hiding something. So when tension appears, you rush in with words, you narrate your innocence, you perform your decency. Not because you're weak, because you're human. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that love, respect, and safety were conditional. That staying good meant staying legible. And now that old reflex activates automatically. Someone hints, someone implies, someone subtly reframes you, and you step forward to prove. But here's the truth most people never see. The strongest people in the room aren't busy defending their goodness. They don't rush to be cleared. They don't scramble to be understood. They don't sit in the defendant's chair. Not because they're cold, not because they don't care, but because they know something you're just beginning to sense. Worth that needs to be proven is already on trial. And freedom begins the moment you realize you don't have to enter the courtroom at all.
If you felt exposed by that last part, good. Not because you're wrong, but because it touched something real. Let's slow this down. You don't explain because you're weak. You don't justify because you lack backbone. You don't rush to be understood because you're insecure. You do it because you're human, a social animal, wired for connection, programmed long before logic to stay inside the group. To be understood meant survival. To be accepted meant safety. To be seen as good meant you weren't alone. So when tension shows up, your nervous system reacts faster than your values. Explain, clarify, fix the image. Explain so you can be understood. Justify so you can be seen as good. Speak so you don't get cast out. That impulse didn't come from weakness. It came from adaptation. Thousands of years ago, silence could mean exile. Misunderstanding could mean death. Being misread could cost you everything. So your body learned something simple. When in doubt, explain. When threatened, justify. When judged, perform goodness. And it worked for a long time. That's why this reflex feels automatic. Why it rises before you even think. Why your mouth opens before your spine straightens. You're not broken for doing this. You're patterned. Most people never question it. They just keep explaining, keep adjusting, keep sanding themselves down until they fit. So if you hear yourself in this, don't turn it into self-attack. Say this instead. Of course I react this way. Of course I want to be understood. Of course I want to be seen as good. That need isn't shameful, it's ancient. Like a tree bending in wind. Like an animal scanning for safety. Like a mountain absorbing pressure over time. There's nothing wrong with the instinct itself. The problem isn't that you explain. The problem is when explaining becomes your identity. When being understood becomes more important than being grounded. When being seen as good becomes more important than being free. That's when the instinct stops protecting you and starts controlling you. But we're not there yet. First, you had to see this clearly, without blame, without harshness, without turning it into another reason to prove yourself. You're not wrong for wanting understanding. You're not flawed for seeking approval. The question is quieter than that. What happens when this old survival reflex is no longer serving you, but you keep obeying it anyway?
But here's where it turns. That instinct you just forgave yourself for, it has a shadow. Because every time you try to prove you're a good person, something subtle happens. You accept their scale, their definition, their moral ruler. You don't notice it because it sounds reasonable. I'm just clarifying. I just want to explain what really happened. I don't want to be misunderstood. But that's not clarification anymore. That's performance. Clarifying is about truth. Performing is about approval. And the moment you start performing goodness, you step into a cage you didn't build, but you lock from the inside. Think about it. If you're truly just explaining facts, why does it feel so tense? Why does your chest tighten? Why does your voice change? Because you're not protecting reality. You're protecting an image. The image of being kind, reasonable, safe to approve of. So you adjust yourself. You soften edges. You bend motives. Like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. You stretch here, shrink there, until you vaguely resemble what they're comfortable seeing. And the worst part? The more you explain, the less solid you feel. Because now, your worth depends on how well you perform, on how convincing you sound, on whether they nod at the end. This is how being a good person becomes a prison. Not because goodness is bad, but because goodness, once outsourced, stops being yours. You start asking questions you never agreed to answer. Was my tone okay? Did I care enough? Did I say it right? You're not standing in your values anymore.
You're orbiting someone else's judgment, and the orbit tightens. Each explanation pulls you further in. Each justification reinforces the idea that you owe clarity to anyone who feels uneasy around you. You don't. A mountain doesn't flatten itself because someone finds it intimidating. An oak doesn't apologize for casting shade. They don't perform strength. They simply are. But you keep talking, keep proving, keep hoping this time they'll finally see you as good enough and let you rest. They won't. Because once you accept the role, the trial never ends. And here's the line that's hard to swallow. You're not afraid of being wrong. You're afraid of being seen as not good, not bad, just not good enough. And that fear didn't come from nowhere. It was planted early, watered often, rewarded consistently. So before we talk about silence, before we talk about strength, there's a deeper question waiting underneath all of this. Why does being seen as not good feel so dangerous to you in the first place?
You learned this earlier than you remember. Short praise when you behaved. Warm smiles when you stayed quiet. Approval when you fit the shape they needed. And when you didn't, when you questioned, when you felt too much, when you were inconvenient, the warmth pulled back. Not with cruelty, with silence, with distance, with that cold, confusing absence that a child can't explain. So you adapted. You learned the rules fast. Be good, be easy, be agreeable, because love felt safer when it was earned. And somewhere along the way, a belief settled in, not spoken, not taught directly, but felt. If I want to be loved, I have to be good. If I want closeness, I can't cause friction. If I want safety, I need to perform. Like an oak growing in a narrow space, you didn't choose the direction. You grew where the light was allowed. That belief didn't disappear when you grew up. It just matured. You became an adult, but the logic stayed the same. Only the audience changed. Now it's your family, your partner, your boss, your friends, society. Same reflex, different stage. You explain yourself too much. You soften your edges. You over-clarify your intentions, not because you're addicted to proving your point, but because you're addicted to emotional safety. Let that land. You don't crave validation. You crave relief. The relief of knowing you're not about to lose connection. The relief of staying inside the circle. The relief of not being emotionally abandoned. That's not weakness. That's conditioning. Like a mountain shaped by constant wind, you didn't become this overnight. Pressure after pressure taught you where it was safe to stand. And here's the part most people miss. You weren't trying to be impressive. You were trying to be safe. Safe from withdrawal. Safe from disapproval. Safe from that familiar cold distance that once felt unbearable. So of course you explain. Of course you justify. Of course silence feels dangerous. Your nervous system learned that silence once meant losing love. And no philosopher would shame you for that. Even the Stoics understood this truth. Epictetus spoke about freedom not as toughness, but as unlearning false dependencies. This was one of them. The need to be good to be loved. The need to be understood to be safe. The need to explain to remain connected. You didn't choose this pattern, but you've been living inside it. And slowly, quietly, it stopped being something you do, and it became who you are.
And this is where it shows up now. Everywhere. You apologize for choices that never needed permission. You explain things that were already clear. You soften your voice before anyone even challenges you. You say sorry for having boundaries, for changing your mind, for wanting something different. You over-explain your intentions. You add context no one asked for. You rush to prove you're not selfish, not careless, not one of those people. You do it at work. You do it with family. You do it with strangers. Same pattern, same reflex. You fear being misunderstood, not because misunderstanding is fatal, but because somewhere inside, being misunderstood still feels like being unsafe. So you manage perception. You choose words carefully. You rehearse explanations in your head. You preempt criticism before it arrives. You're not living. You're managing risk. Like an oak constantly trimmed to look harmless, you're strong but never allowed to spread. And it's exhausting. You feel it in your body, that tight chest, that shallow breath, that quiet resentment you don't want to admit. Because while everyone sees a good person, you feel yourself disappearing. Here's the hard truth. You're no longer living by values. You're living by optics. You don't ask, is this true for me? You ask, will this make me look bad? You don't choose what aligns. You choose what keeps the peace. Not inner peace, social peace. And it costs you. It costs your honesty. It costs your energy. It costs your self-respect. Like a mountain constantly bracing for storms that never fully arrive, you stay tense, even on clear days. You're not free. You're approved. Approved by people who aren't even paying that much attention. And the cruel irony, the more you try to look like a good person, the further you drift from being a real one. Because goodness without choice isn't virtue, it's fear in disguise. You didn't end up here. This wasn't your plan, but repetition turned coping into character, and character turned into a cage. So now you're tired. Not tired of life, tired of performing it, tired of explaining, tired of proving, tired of holding a perfect image together with both hands. And when the noise finally settles, one question begins to rise. If the problem isn't the world judging you, then where is it really coming from?
Here's the twist. The world is not judging you. You walked into the courtroom on your own. You sat down in the chair. You put yourself on trial. Every explanation, every justification, every rushed defense, that wasn't society attacking you. That was you prosecuting yourself before anyone else could. And once you see this, something loosens. Because the problem was never silence. It was what you believed silence meant. You were taught that silence is weakness, that silence looks guilty, that silence invites punishment. But that belief came from fear, not truth. Silence from weakness is hiding. Silence from strength is withdrawal. Withdrawal of permission, withdrawal of access, withdrawal of the right others think they have to define you. Silence, when chosen, is not absence. It is presence without performance. Here's the paradox. You thought explaining gave you control, but it gave your power away. Every time you explain too much, you hand the judge's gavel to someone else. You say, you decide if I'm acceptable. You decide if I'm good. You decide if I'm allowed to stand here. And then you wait. That's not humility. That's self-abandonment. The shift begins here. Reaction versus reflection. Reaction is fast. Reaction is loud. Reaction is fear trying to survive another moment. Reflection is slow. Reflection is quiet. Reflection is you remembering who you are before the noise. Think of a mountain. Storms come, winds scream, rain pounds its surface.
The mountain doesn't argue with the storm. It doesn't explain itself to the wind. It doesn't apologize for standing where it stands. It stays, not rigid, not aggressive, still. And because it stays, the storm passes. Your life doesn't need more reaction. It needs more gravity. Gravity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't justify. It simply is, and everything else adjusts. This is where Stoic wisdom quietly enters, not as toughness, as sovereignty. You don't control what others think. You never did. But you control whether their thoughts become your commands. You control whether misunderstanding becomes an emergency or just weather. Jung spoke about the ego's hunger to be seen, not because it's evil, but because it's scared of dissolving. The ego thinks, if I'm not recognized, I don't exist. So it performs, it explains, it begs silently to be understood. But the deeper self doesn't need applause to breathe. It needs alignment. Here's the reframe that changes everything. You do not need to be understood to live correctly.
You need to not betray your values. You don't need clarity from others. You need clarity within. You don't need approval. You need coherence. And coherence is quiet. When you stop explaining, something uncomfortable happens. People project. They assume. They fill the silence with their own stories. Let them. That discomfort you feel, that's withdrawal from an addiction. The addiction to emotional safety through external validation. At first, it feels like standing in a storm without armor. But slowly, you notice something. Most storms were never aimed at you. They were passing through. And the ones that were real, you survived them anyway. Silence teaches you discernment. You stop answering everything. You stop correcting every misconception. You stop rescuing your image. You respond only when it aligns, only when it's clean, only when it's true. Not to convince, not to impress, but to express. This is where the body changes. Breath deepens. Shoulders drop. The constant tension eases because you're no longer on trial. You stepped out of the courtroom. You didn't win the case. You closed it. And here's the quiet power that follows. When you stop explaining yourself, people feel it. Not consciously, viscerally. Some will push, some will test, some will feel threatened by your stillness. That's not your problem. A tree that stops bending reveals who was leaning on it. You don't need to announce this change. You don't need to justify the silence. Let your consistency speak. Let your boundaries teach. Let your calm become unfamiliar and then undeniable. This is not detachment from life. It's attachment to truth. You still care. You just don't chase. You still speak. You just don't spill. You still engage. You just don't plead. That's the transformation. From reaction to reflection. From performance to presence. From fear to gravity. And yes, it's lonely at first. Freedom always is. Because fewer people get access to you, but the right parts of you finally come home. This is not the easy path, but this is the path where you stand upright, unsplit, unapologetic, unowned. This is not the path of being liked. It's the path of being whole. And once you taste that stillness, once you feel what it's like to stop proving your worth, you'll understand something quietly, deeply true. This is not the easy road, but this is the road to freedom.
You don't need to prove that you're a good person. You never did. Goodness isn't something you perform under pressure. It's something you live when no one is watching. When you stop defending yourself, something strange happens. Life gets quieter. Not easier, quieter. Fewer arguments, fewer explanations, fewer invisible battles that only existed in your head. Some people will feel that shift immediately. They'll lean in, they'll push, they'll test the silence. Not because you're wrong, but because your stillness removes the mirror they were using. Let them feel uncomfortable. A storm doesn't get offended when the mountain doesn't respond. It passes. You don't owe the world constant reassurance. You don't owe anyone a running commentary on your values. You don't owe explanations for choices that are honest. What you owe yourself is integrity. To wake up and know you didn't betray yourself for approval. To speak when it matters and stay silent when it doesn't. That kind of life looks lonely from the outside, but inside it's spacious. You breathe differently, you move slower, you choose with intention instead of reflex. This path will cost you something. It will cost you false harmony. It will cost you people who only felt safe when you were small. But it gives something back. It gives you your center. You stop living like you're on trial. You stop rehearsing your defense. You stop waiting for permission to exist as you are. You step out of the courtroom, not angry, not resentful, complete, like an oak that no longer bends for every passing wind, like a mountain that doesn't explain why it stands where it stands, still, rooted, unmoved. If you're learning how to live without constant justification, if you're practicing silence that comes from strength, not fear, if you're choosing values over validation, you're not alone. You're walking a quieter road, a narrower one, but it's solid beneath your feet. This isn't about becoming distant. It's about becoming honest. Not harder, not colder, clearer. And clarity has a gravity of its own. Some will drift away. Some will come closer. Most will simply adjust. That's how you'll know you're standing in the right place. You don't need to announce this shift. You don't need to explain it. Just live it, step by step, choice by choice, silence by silence. This isn't the path of being understood by everyone. It's the path of no longer needing to be. And that's where the real peace begins.